Okay, we are just jumping in right away because I have been holding in all of these feelings for far too long, at least from the internet, and I need to talk about them. So, if you're anyone in the creative space, regardless of what form of art you're doing, you probably noticed that over the course of the last, well, it's really been just about 20 years now, but it's really been more and more apparent in the last 10 that just all the color of movies and shows and just everything seems to be gone. Like, we're not talking the very memeable, like, oh, Game of Thrones is so dark nobody can see it. That's a problem all of its own. But what I'm talking about is how everything has this either blue or yellow color grading where there's no bright pops of color anymore. Everybody is just bland and boring and beige. And speaking of beige, that is the other thing I want to talk about because I believe that Christopher Nolan is to blame for beige moms. I know that sounds like a huge leap in logic, but I haven't prepared this conspiracy board for nothing. I am going to prove it to you. And if you've never been here before, hi, I am Lex Fortune, a cryptid who does media analysis and social commentary, I suppose. And I really hope that by the end of this video, I can maybe earn your subscription. Okay, let's get into it. Our story begins here in 2005 with the release of Batman Begins. Now, what do I mean by this? Well, the thing is that before Batman Begins, superhero movies were pretty silly. And sure, we had started to see some of the Frank Miller adaptations around this time as well. People were sort of getting hungrier for a more adult superhero film. And that's how we basically ended up getting Christopher Nolan's Batman. And what I find so sad about this in particular is that if it was just Christopher Nolan and he was just executing a personal style, I wouldn't have any issue with it at all. But the problem is that his influence, starting with Batman Begins, is sort of like the beginning of a cultural ripple. So it all began with Batman Begins, okay? And of course, like I just mentioned, it wasn't just about the color that made Batman Begins so special. It was much more adult. You know, previous iterations of Batman, for any of you who are young enough to not know, were pretty silly, and I'll try to maybe put in a few clips or pictures at least here so that you can get an idea of what I was talking about. And for the record, I love Batman Forever and Batman and Robin, okay? But they were very, very silly and very colorful. At the time, pretty much every superhero was like kid friendly. And Batman Begins was, where we got that first gritty superhero, the superhero who was for adults. And for anyone in the film industry out there, I do get it that using certain color gradings in your movies or shorts or TV shows or whatever is a great shorthand for what you're trying to get across. Obviously, Gotham is a dark and dreary place where bad stuff happens all the time. So it makes sense that the shorthand to convey that visually would be grays and blacks and very pale, you know, blues and everything. And yeah, it also makes sense that bright colors and, rainbows and wacky patterns is very kid coded. We all have the understanding that children respond well to bright colors, especially like when they're babies and stuff. It helps their brains develop. So I do get again why these things happened initially. But the problem is that even if the push from Batman Begins wasn't intentional to begin this insane inertia of colorlessness and a fixation on like a lack of fun. It still happened, and so I'm still blaming it. Now, you might be thinking, Lex, what's the problem with making superhero movies for adults? Like, Sin City, Watchmen, 300, all of those were graphic novels, aka comics, and not superheroes by a traditional sense, but you get what I mean. And I would say, yeah, of course, there's room to have that more gritty stuff. And again, to the film people out there, the way Sin City is filmed is just spectacular. It is so good. The problem with something seminal is that people want to copy what made it so important and impactful. There's a reason why I think it is a lot of people's instinct to sort of get mad when a previously niche thing that they like becomes mainstream, becomes extremely popular with everybody. Even though it does feel good to have an artist that you love get the recognition that you feel they deserve, you also know that with popularity comes copycats, like I was just talking about. When you have a ripple, it's copies of copies of copies. And I don't mean copy necessarily in a malicious way in every case. I mean, inspiration is very important. And if we've learned anything from the digital era of content, it's that people make more of what performs well. Then, 2006. Burberry relaunches its signature plaid-ish looking collection. It has a name. I looked it up. I will put it on the screen, hopefully right there. And yes, I do know that I am fixating on one luxury brand out of many. And just to kind of address that, both Gucci and Louis Vuitton have like kind of famous brown also like patterns. Usually, luxury brands, for anyone who doesn't know, they'll have like sort of two key designs that are recognizable that they sort of oscillate between. Anyways, Burberry. I just thought that this was an excellent example of what was to come. Palette of this print is extremely muted. Even the reds look more dramatic in my pencil crayon than they do on the actual fabrics. So this is just sort of like what was really coming into fashion, because Burberry had kind of been losing its edge in the luxury world at the time. And when it relaunched this pattern, it became the superstar that it even currently is to this day. Also, Departed wins Movie of the Year. Film of the Year? Whatever. The big main Oscar. I hate the Oscars. Anyways, the point is, The Departed, as we all know, very famous cops and robbers type of movie, right? Very, very gray color grading. And obviously, yes, The Departed would have been in production at the same time as Batman Begins, so it couldn't possibly have been inspired by it, or probably wasn't. But it just is showing the pattern that was existing at this time. But I am pinning it on Christopher Nolan, and you'll see why as I go forward. Year 2007 was very important for a lot of reasons, but mainly Call of Duty 4 Modern Warfare. Now listen, Call of Duty was indeed perfectly popular before Modern Warfare, but it was a World War II game. It was a game that people who liked World War II games played. However, Modern Warfare was set obviously in the present day. And so it sort of revitalized this interest because it was something completely new. And its multiplayer mode generated an entire new generation of Call of Duty fans. In sort of the same way that Halo's multiplayer had made this generation of kids who would get all their friends together just to play Halo, well, exactly the same thing happened with Modern Warfare. I know probably that some of you younger creatures out there don't necessarily remember a time before online play was a thing, but yeah, the internet used to not be on game consoles, and so you could only play with your friends by, like I said, getting them together to play together. This way, you could get your friends together to play, but you could all be at your own houses. You could play with people from, well, Not necessarily anywhere in the world, but anywhere in your region. Now, I think we can all agree that Call of Duty online lobbies are a scourge upon modern humanity and probably should have never been created. It is indeed a monster that got away from its creator, in my opinion. But, anyways, what am I saying? Division is also a monster, and Blizzard is a monster. And the point I'm trying to make about Modern Warfare was that because it was, present day, as in takes place around the Middle East in a lot of cases. Desert camo was the big thing, right? Which is, wouldn't you know it, beige camo instead of the previously warm blues or greens of the World War II games. Now we had sort of this beige and brown and white digital camo, desert camo, just the overall setting of a desert. Also beige, just saying. Sand. Oh my gosh, okay, I think I'm gonna have to put this at the beginning of the video, but this thing right here, this drawing I did, is probably going to be horrifically misconstrued, so I just want to clarify right off the bat that what I meant with this was that we were starting to let go of the idea of like hyper strict gender norms. So I didn't know how to visually convey that other than this, but this kind of just looks like I'm saying that I'm against men or women in general. And I mean, like, don't get me wrong, I love me some androgyny, okay? Nothing hotter to me than a person for whom their gender is a well kept mystery, and I like it that way. But, oh yeah, and just before we move into 2008, 2007, No Country for Old Men won Best Picture. Best Picture, that's what it is. I knew I would get there. Again, it was a Cormac McCarthy book. By the way, have you ever tried to read Cormac McCarthy? It is a slog. He doesn't use dialogue indicators, so you're basically just always guessing what is talking and what is the character's thoughts. Hubert Selby Jr., the author of Requiem for a Dream, also does this, and I hate it. Again, though, desert setting, very yellow color graded, washing out any sort of like brightness or distinctness, very low contrast. So it was taking shape. And moving into 2008, we can see Slumdog Millionaire, which again, even though there are obviously parts of it that take place in more colorful areas, a lot of it is set in like really sullen, dark, or colors that are associated with either poverty or, look, it's a movie that's very, very sad and upsetting. And anyway, I don't want to talk about Slumdog Millionaire anymore because much, much, much more importantly, in 2008, we got The Dark Knight. That is the moment in which the earth cracked open and Christopher Nolan's hand reached up and sucked all the color and fun out of media. And if you're thinking, oh, Lex, but The Dark Knight had the Joker. Yeah. Did you see how they dressed Heath Ledger's Joker? Nothing about the performance, but even the purple suit was extremely muted. All the colors were washed out. It was the lowest key clown you could do before it would no longer read as clown. Right here, the symbol is meant to visually indicate that it was around this point in time, around 2008, 2009, 2010, we were really, really much better as a society at letting go of like hyper strict gender norms. We were seeing a lot more acceptance of, you know, I don't want to say that it was acceptance of necessarily trans people because let's face it, it's 2026 and we're still apparently not all the way there, but I digress. It's more so that, clothing and colors, accessories started to kind of lose their hypergenderedness. Obviously, the alts and the goths were always keeping it real with their makeup and their nail polish, and they were having fun, but I'm really staying focused on more mainstream stuff right now. Also, I just have to say that looking at this board, I realize that because I was just doing like funny pen drawings of everything, my drawings are so much more colorful than anything that it is actually referencing. But moving along, 2009. Obviously, lots of things are happening around these years. Okay, it was a big time for video games, especially, and I just can't talk about all of them. So I picked out Demon Souls because it started the Dark Souls franchise, and that basically invented a new genre of game. I mean, I'm pretty sure it's called Souls-like now because you didn't have whatever it is. It's sort of its own thing if you're not a gamer. I can't play them. Don't get me wrong. I absolutely could not play Demon Souls and Dark Souls and Bloodborne. I couldn't play any of it. No, no. But again, Demon Souls, very dreary, very dark. Everything was grays and, blacks and browns. And again, like everything might have like the odd pop of color, but don't get pedantic on me, okay? You know that things were so washed out. Even the ghosts that were blue, well, like ghosts, souls, spirits, whatever you want to call them, in Demon Souls were like a very, very pale blue. Now we have 2010, another incredibly important year. In fact, potentially the turning point at which beige moms were created. And what's crazy to me in specific is that I am of the age where I would have been young-ish in 2010 to have a kid, but not unheard of to have a baby at whatever age I was back then. And a lot of people were becoming parents back then. And it boggles my mind that the same girls who would have grown up with, Lisa Frank and all of that 80s and 90s vaporwave, like colorfulness. I mean, they must have hated it or something. I just cannot fathom because that was the generation who turned into sad beige moms. So why is 2010 so special and specific? Well, first and foremost, Pinterest is launched. Pinterest is a massive thing for beige moms and also for literally again, it's a specific thing that I could only describe as Pinteresty. Like a person I knew had a very Pinterest wedding. And what I meant by that was, green lace, burlap, cowboy boots, mason jars, fairy lights. Pinterest allowed a subsection of people who were looking for that super modern, super clean, super nothing aesthetic and share it with the entire world. And then it just blew up. Also released in 2010, Urban Decay's absolute tentpole makeup palette, The Naked. This was the first Naked, and there would be many others to follow, but this was a game changer. Urban Decay before this had very much been an alt focused brand, I would say. A lot of their stuff was high impact, high color, high glitter. And then they did The Naked when, I'm not gonna lie, there was an era, different things come in and out of fashion. Of course they do. And I'm not gonna fault anyone for following a trend. I've followed many in my life, although I mean, I, anyways. And at the time, following, I suppose, a lot of heavy makeup, uh, And I suppose after many decades of very intense, involved makeup looks, uh, the whole no makeup look became a huge thing. And Urban Decay's Naked Palette became a big part of that. It really moved the needle forward in being this accessible, but like slightly higher quality, and we can fight about this in the comments because don't get me wrong, I love Urban Decay and I have the Naked Cherry eyeshadow palette, but the fallout is just it's just like you get so much under your eyes that it feels like I'm taking off an entire look's worth of eyeshadow off from under my eyes. Anyways, and the colors that I have on here are not at all representative of the kind of colors that are actually on the palette. I'll put a picture in, but I was trying to go for like everything being hand drawn. I thought it was fun. Yeah, they're not this bright. So, as you can see, 2010 also had Black Swan, which, as movies go, I think had a pretty good impact. Not as high impact as some other stuff that I've talked about or will talk about, but it certainly was an art film that hit the mainstream, in my opinion. Darren Aronofsky makes films that are so much more artistic than I think we usually get, and it is incredible and sometimes very disturbing. I wouldn't recommend Mother unless you have a really strong, like, I'm not, anyways, no, we're not getting into it. I keep getting distracted. So, what happens when it becomes vogue to have no color in your house, no color in your makeup, no color in your freaking films, and presumably, even though I forgot to put it up here, no color in your clothes. Beige moms. Moms who won't buy their kids toys or bedding or decorations that have an ounce of anything other than white and brown. And yes, beige is brown. I'm not going to list out all the shades of beige. So as you can see, 2010 was really a linchpin year. As you can see, 2011 is represented down here by Skyrim, and I'm pretty sure I don't need to tell anybody about Skyrim. But dreary, grays, browns, boring to look at, fun to play, very fun to play. Then 2012, The Dark Knight Rises. Now, I understand that this was not nearly as groundbreaking or earth shattering as either of the other movies, but it capped off the trilogy. It was what everyone was waiting for, and it sort of skyrocketed Christopher Nolan into this position where he was just making these absolute massive blockbusters. And he did do other movies in between here. For example, Inception was also 2010, and I didn't talk about it because, again, if I talked about everything, I would be going on for literally ever. And I just really wanted to focus in terms of Christopher Nolan on his Batman movies because I believe that they are the core of the problem. Now, we are going to do a bit of a time jump from 2012 to 2015. And there are reasons that I won't bore you with for that because basically I'm looking at the tent poles of this problem. But before I go right to 2015, I just want to address one thing, and that is TV shows that premiered. Here we go. 2006, Dexter. 2007, Mad Men. 2008, Breaking Bad. 2010, Pretty Little Liars. 2010, Sherlock. 2010, The Walking Dead. 2011, Game of Thrones. Now, based on everything I've just been saying, I'm pretty sure that you can put together what I'm saying here. I mean, out of all of these shows, probably Dexter had the best color palette, and even it often had those bluey kind of color graded scenes. These were all shows that basically shaped the mainstream fandom for an entire decade, and they were all done in very bland colors. Again, it's not a commentary on the quality of the media. I loved Breaking Bad, even though it's a show that I'll never be able to watch again. It was incredible. And like Sherlock is fine to look at. I don't know so much about the quality of its writing and or its writer, but that is neither here nor there. Haven't watched Mad Men yet. Should I? Walking Dead, yellow color grading, mostly because it's forests and deserts and gray cityscapes, of course. So, again, I don't need to say too much more, I think. So, what happens in 2015? Well, two very important things: Man of Steel and the Cinderella live action remake. Man of Steel, much like Batman Begins, began another superhero universe where everything is supposed to be like, oh, it's super adult, it's gritty and dark, it has more murder and more violence and more sexiness. I don't really remember if Man of Steel had anything sexy in it. I honestly could barely sit through that movie once. But my point is that Zack Snyder was already famous for doing like dark and gritty stuff, which was fine when he was doing material that was already meant to be dark and gritty. But I'm pretty sure in hindsight, everybody can agree that Superman was not the superhero to do dark and gritty. Like I said, Batman, I can kind of get with the cinematic shorthand of Gotham being already dark and dreary. No excuse for Superman. And like I said, the colors that I actually drew this with are way more colorful than anything that's actually on the box or the movie poster or whatever. So, the Snyderverse and the beginning of the DCEU amplified the problem tenfold. Marvel was still keeping it somewhat colorful. Obviously, the first Avengers came out in 2012, and it had quite a good bit of color, and I really liked that they, for the most part, stayed true to a lot of the comic outfits, just kind of like modernized them a little bit. But if you look, they too fell victim to slowly draining the color out of everything and just making everything muted shades. You know, dark maroon reds and dark navy blues or washed out pastel-y type colors. Anyways, so the Snyderverse, as we know, made everything worse. And then Disney Cinderella was the first of the live action remakes that have plagued us ever since. Why Disney thought it needed to remake every single golden era movie in live action is, well, I actually kind of do know the answer to that, and it's nostalgia. Remember how I was commenting how the moms who were beige moms were probably young women slash teens or whatever, preteen girls in the 80s and 90s when, colors were the biggest thing. Well, nostalgia is one of the biggest sellers, and especially for the generations that I'm in and the one right before mine. Literally, it's proven over and over and over again. Why do you think they keep remaking everything or just like doing like new versions of old stuff or like re-releasing like figures and remastering movies? It's all nostalgia, right? Because people don't actually miss being a child for the most part. They miss the feeling of not having any responsibilities or anything weighing on them. They miss being ignorant of how terrible the world can be. And I get that. Trust me, I get that. Why do you think I love to disappear into a world of whimsy so much of the time? But I still don't think that that's a good excuse to suddenly make everything into a franchise that already exists, or worse, take movies that were really best known for their animation, like Cinderella and Snow White, than their actual stories. They were public domain fairy tales, basically, right? And again, this is so much more colorful than the actual movie poster, and the dress is not this colorful. It's just, again, the pens that I had available. They took her dress and made it like dulled down, and yeah, it's like, oh, it's glittery, or it has like a couple butterflies on it, or bows, or whatever they are, but like, if you look at the trend of the live action Disney plague, all of those movies, again, are washed out color wise. Snow White, I think I did not see it, but it seemed from the clips that I saw about all the people complaining about it that they incorporated some color into it, but it still seemed just very dreary. And I just don't think that color needs to necessarily mean child. Like, just because children's things are colorful, adult things can be colorful too, and you just have two things that are true at once, like it isn't one being one way or one the other way. It's sort of like when you start pulling at the thread of why anything is like gendered, like clothes, like why, what inherently about the skirt is meant for a woman that isn't meant for a man, or in my case, a non-binary cryptid, like nothing. It's just social structures. And once you start pulling at that thread, you realize that the why of pretty much everything that we sort of like force ourselves into these like boxes and labels is just social pressure. And anyways, the reason I bring that up is because I don't think we should be limiting ourselves, especially in the art world, to this boring, dull, just sad beige life. When I suggest that you add a little more color into your life, I mean it both literally and metaphorically. Artistically speaking, I think we are all craving something that treats the eyes to something new and fresh, something that pulls our attention, not just because it's short, but because it's good. We have got to get attention spans back to at least somewhat normal. And I think that probably part of what affected attention spans, it's not all phones, it's not all TikTok, it's that none of this stuff is fun to look at. And that matters. That really actually matters. So I blame one man for all of this, and that is Christopher Nolan. Okay, so that's my conspiracy. Do you agree? Do you disagree? Do you think somebody else is to blame for sad beige moms? Let me know in the comments. And if you're still watching right now, thank you so, so much. I mean, thank you to absolutely everybody who watched any amount of this or watched it in parts or whatever. But watch time is like the #1 metric that YouTube uses to gauge if they should recommend your channel. So it really just does mean the world to me. I hope you had fun doing this with me, and I really hope that you're taking good care of yourself because you absolutely deserve it. Okay, have a good one. Bye.